Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, good evening. My name is Professor Christophe Godin. I am the director of the Ocean Institute. Welcome to the University Club of Western Australia. It is a great pleasure to see so many of you here and a privilege to host tonight's public lecture on behalf of the Ocean Institute. I would like to start by acknowledging that the University of Western Australia is situated on Noongar land. I pay my respects to the Whadjuk people, Noongar people, past and present, as the spiritual and cultural custodian of this land, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on whose land and waters our researcher works. I extend a warm welcome to Professor Anna Nowak, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research at the University of Western Australia, Dr. Jack Clough, Chairman of the Ocean Institute Advisory Board, and Janet Holmes-Harcourt, AC. I also extend our welcome to the Honourable Sophie McNeill, MLC, our distinguished state and local government guest, Professor James Arvanitekis, Research Foundation Director, and Dr. Luke Toomey, CEO of WAMSI. Fellow researchers, friends of the Ocean Institute, and our valued community members, welcome. The Ocean Institute brings together researchers, policymakers, industry leaders, and communities around a simple but profound idea. Our prosperity and our well-being is inseparable from the future of the ocean. Tonight's lecture could not be more aligned with that mission, nor more timely. We are honored to welcome Ambassador Peter Thomson, the United Nations Secretary General Special Envoy for the Ocean. In his role, Peter Thomson has been one of the most influential global voice for ocean stewardship, multilateral cooperation, and science-based action. He has been central to advancing Sustainable Development Goal 14, to the establishment of the UN Ocean Conference, and most recently to landmark achievements such as the High Seas Treaty, which for the first time enables comprehensive governance of ocean areas beyond national jurisdiction. But beyond titles and treaties, Peter Thomson is known for his clarity of purpose and his ability to connect science, policy, and moral responsibility. He reminds us consistently and persuasively that there can be no healthy planet without a healthy ocean, and that the ocean's health is now measurably in decline. That brings us to the theme of tonight's lecture, the ocean's health and what we are trying to do to fix it. This is an urgent conversation. Globally, we are witnessing accelerating ocean warming, acidification, biodiversity loss, coral bleaching, overfishing, and pollution. They are no longer distant or abstract threats. They are systemic risks to food security, climate stability, and intergenerational justice. At the same time, this conversation is deeply local. Here in Western Australia, we are custodian of one of the longest and most ecologically significant coastline on Earth. From Ningaloo to the Kimberley, from the Southern Ocean to the Indian Ocean Rim, our state sits at the front line of both ocean impact and ocean opportunity. Recent coral bleaching at Ningaloo is a stark reminder that even relatively well-managed systems are not immune to global change. Western Australia is also central to the future sustainable and regenerative blue economy, from fisheries and aquaculture to offshore renewable, marine science, and indigenous sea country stewardship. The choice we make here matters, not just locally, but globally. This is why tonight's lecture matters. It speaks to the intersection of science, policy, economics, and ethics. It challenges us not only to understand what is happening to our ocean, but to consider what leadership looks like globally, nationally, and here in Western Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming a global champion for the ocean, a steadfast advocate for multilateral action, and a powerful voice for future generations, Ambassador Peter Thomson.
Thank you very much, Christophe. Deeply appreciate that. Just three little preambles before I start my address. Firstly, just to save you the trouble, because I do it myself, trying to work out the accent of the speaker and where he or she comes from. I'm the fifth generation Fijian. Suva is my hometown. Suva boys' grammar, this is the way anybody from there speaks, sort of halfway between San Francisco and Sydney, I guess. The other thing is you're probably wondering why I'm holding these frangipanis. I was getting some fresh air out the back, and there's this lovely frangipani tree there, and these are the flowers that my wife wore in her hair when we got married. Next month, 54 years ago in Fiji. So. And this is the the last of my preambles is that I usually limit my talks to 10 minutes because I figure that's the average span of human attention, but this is double that. This is a 20-minute address, and I did say to Christoph, I'll cut it down if you like. He said, no, go for it, because there was basically everything in it is stuff I want to say to you anyway, so there goes. But bear with me, and if some people nod off, I'll understand. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for this privilege, obviously, of addressing the University Club of Western Australia. First time I've done it, and first time I made a speech in Perth, although I think I first came here in 1965 on a ship passing through. The rather prosaic title of my address this evening is The Ocean's Health and What We're Trying to Do to Fix It. So anyone who's familiar with my work as the Special Envoy for the Ocean will have heard the mantra, no healthy planet without a healthy ocean, and the ocean's health is currently measurably in decline. So if you address virtually all the indices of overfishing and biodiversity loss and pollution, or of acidification or warming and deoxygenation, or of the integrity of ocean currents, or loss of coral, rising sea levels, the list goes on. And you will find that oceans' well-being is under threat, in most cases under accelerating threat. So you may have noticed, for example, that last year the World Meteorological Organization's report where they said that 2024 levels of heat-trapping carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere surged by the largest margin ever recorded. WMO's Greenhouse Gas Bulletin pinned that spike on three key drivers. Firstly, the continued emissions from fossil fuels. Secondly, the increased CO2 from wildfires. Imagine the linkage. And thirdly, the weakening carbon sinks like forests and the ocean. So to quote WMO, these sinks normally absorb a large portion of human-made carbon emissions, but in 2024 they fell short and set the stage for a dangerous feedback loop. So around the world we've seen that with the resulting heat waves and unprecedented in scale, damaging fisheries, seagrass, meadows, and other marine ecosystems. And it's not hyperbole to say that ultimately the continuing decline in the ocean's health presents us with an existential problem as a species on this planet. So what are we going to do about it? Title of the speech. Well, for some time now, we've been aware of the challenges facing the ocean, thanks to the empirical evidence gathered by ocean scientists, such as many of you present, as well as anecdotal evidence witnessed by people like me, divers, fishermen, and beachcombers, all of which categories I find myself falling within. And so as a global community back in 2015, and this is where Christoph's introduction of me, I was a Fiji ambassador for 7 years in the UN, and this is what we were fighting for. Back in 2015, we built up to this Paris Climate Agreement and the UN's 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. And we insisted that incorporated within the latter is the ocean goal. It was off the table prior to that. We brought it on the table, and it's called SDG 14. Most of you would know about that. It sets out to conserve and sustainably use the ocean's resources. That balance is so important. It's in pursuit of SDG 14's implementation that my work on behalf of the ocean is driven. So to keep the implementation of SDG 14 honest, that's where we introduced and invented, really, the UN Ocean Conference system, the third conference of this system having been held in Nice last June, and I'm sure some of you were there. And from Nice, a huge wave of ocean action has emanated. The fact that over 60 heads of government and state, along with over 100 ministers and 15,000 official delegates, all attended the Nice conference, clearly demonstrates that as well as engaging with the potential of the sustainable blue economy, that the world is now fully aware of the problems besetting the ocean's well-being. So it's no longer okay, as it was prior to 2015, to hide behind a veil of benighted innocence on the subject of the ocean's declining health. So to effectively address the decline, it was recognized that remedial policies and actions must be based on the best of scientific consensus. Accordingly, the Community of Nations instituted the UN Decade of Ocean Science, which is set to run between 2021 and 2030. And in spite of some recent recalcitrance, which of course hits the news all the time, we can observe that never before in human history has so much attention been given to ocean science. I mentioned the wave of ocean action that has emanated from last year's UN Ocean Conference, foremost amongst which is that we have negotiated, signed and ratified the BB&J High Seas Treaty. And the treaty came into force last month, allowing us for the first time to comprehensively govern the high seas. At the World Trade Organization, we have signed, negotiated and ratified the first part of the agreement on fisheries subsidies, curtailing the madness of billions of dollars worth of public monies being spent annually on subsidizing industrialized fishing fleets to go out and overfish declining stocks of fish in the ocean. So to combat illegal and unreported and unregulated fisheries, FAO's Port States Measures Agreement has made steady progress in preventing vessels from engaging in IUU fishing, from using ports to land their illegal catches. And to date, 108 states have now signed the agreement, with the latest to join being Saudi Arabia and the Ukraine and China. On the legal front, recognizing that so much of the climate's and thereby the ocean's ailments relate directly to the burning of fossil fuels, Vanuatu, neighbor country in Fiji, initiated a request for an advisory opinion from humanity's highest global court, the International Court of Justice. The court's opinion was delivered in July last year, in which it affirmed that states have binding obligations to prevent climate harm, and that they can be held responsible for failing to do so. That remains to be tested, of course. So much has been done on the means to improvement, but as long as that decline to which I was referring continues, we have so much more work to do. And while game-changing innovations and technological breakthroughs are exciting moments, we need to remember that where international consensus is required, progress is often painstakingly protracted. So it's work for others to do. Younger people, such as those I see in the audience, have got to take that baton up. But push on we must. Hope demands that of us. Intergenerational justice demands that of us. We must push on the achievement of an internationally binding treaty to regulate plastic and unregulated industry, with the adoption of circular models that minimize waste and support transition to sustainable materials and systems, such as I was so happy to see this afternoon out at Ulu. We must push on with IMO's commitment to reducing GHG emissions from international shipping. And we've got to push on with that job of completing the job at WTO on banning harmful fisheries subsidies that lead to the overcapacity of fishing fleets. That's under negotiation now. I'm happy to say the Australian ambassador in Geneva, with whom I met recently, is leading that charge. And we have to push on with the transition to clean, equitably electrified world, a clean and electrified world. And it's got to be powered by wind and hydro dynamic power, by biomass and geothermal and solar energy. And scientific logic demands of that, but now the good news is that economic logic demands the same. So, ladies and gentlemen, when I consider what matters most to me in this business of living, it is the ever-blessed continuity, the passing down of the genes and the culture and the knowledge from generation to generation, which is why I place so much emphasis on this messaging of the principle of intergenerational justice. But if I go from there to questions of veneration, I find myself in awe of Mother Nature, and more particularly in the blood flowing through her arteries, namely the hydrological cycle. For in effect, it's the planet's continuous solar-powered recycling of water that holds our lives in its great global grasp. The eternal circle turns and turns, and the planet is blue, its water's the base of life, but it is the movement of the water that matters. Well, the hydrological cycle has shaped our world and has dictated how and where we live on the planet. It is thus that our future will be shaped by how we interfere with that virtuous cycle, be it through further warming and polluting of the ocean, or how we might correct our ways through the schemes of governments and geoengineers, or dare we even hope through the betterment of our behavior. So when we talk about the source to sea principle, or as we put it in the Pacific Islands, the ridge to reef principle, we're addressing the fact that basically whatever goes into our drains and creeks or rivers eventually ends up in the ocean. If it's toxic, it destroys ecosystems. If it's minuscule, like microplastics, it gets absorbed by the marine environment and is eaten by the shellfish and fish that we in turn consume. So ladies and gentlemen, as well as conserving the ocean, SDG 14 calls for the sustainable use of the ocean's resources. Getting that balance right, I referred to it earlier, between conservation and sustainable use is vital. For billions of people on the planet depend on seafood for a significant part of their sustenance. And around the world, when we talk about the sustainable blue economy, it's become necessary to add the word regenerative to our discussions. And this has become so because of the poor state of the ocean's health, and also, thankfully, because the ocean possesses such amazing abilities of recovery and resilience. And I put it to you that if we're prepared to take the necessary actions to unleash these regenerative processes, we will in tandem be able to replenish our own reserves of hope. So there's a logical train of thought which demonstrates that wherever you are in the world, it's just not possible to have a sustainable blue economy unless you have a healthy ocean, with the corollary being that renewable energy is essential to a healthy ocean. And one only need think of ocean warming to find the veracity in that statement. Whether it's sustainable aquaculture or coastal tourism or marine biotechnology, we just cannot expect to enjoy economic progress from a marine environment that is overheated, acidic, polluted, and overexploited. It is thus that if the ocean had one thing to say to us, it would be stop burning fossil fuels. Successful development of the sustainable blue economy will rest on ensuring that as much of the ocean as possible, both on the high seas and within our exclusive economic zones, is covered by what we call sustainable ocean plans. So in conformity with the Australian Prime Minister's membership, long-serving membership, of the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy, which is a group of 18 serving heads of state and government who meet every year in New York. An Australian Prime Minister has been a member of that since its inception, probably 8 years ago. In conformity with that and the panel's agreement to institute sustainable ocean plans within all members' jurisdictions, it's very encouraging to note that Australia's plan is currently in the final stages of development. Because these sustainable ocean plans are critical instruments, both for the integration of ocean-related priorities, international development agendas, but also for their contribution to the implementation of, excuse the long speak, but it's Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. If you haven't heard of that, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, believe me, it's one of the foundational agreements that humanity currently has in terms of our problems on this planet. So the framework includes this target of conserving and effectively managing at least 30% of the planet by 2030, but in our case, the ocean, marine and coastal areas by 2030. That's what we're working on. And 30 by 30, it's a high task for us all. And nobody should be prepared to dodge this, lest you want to be prepared to see millions of species going over that waterfall of extinction. These are not made-up things. This is not, as President Trump calls, evil intention people like me trying to spread untruths. This is the best of Earth's scientists coming together at the Convention for Biodiversity in Montreal, which is why it's called the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework. And the best of our ocean scientists, Earth scientists, basically saying we've got to do this 30 by 30. So in recognition of that pressing responsibility, at the UN Ocean Conference in Nice last year, we launched, when I say we, the Friends of Ocean Action, which is the World Economic Forum platform that I happen to co-chair, we launched the 30 by 30 Ocean Action Plan in the context of developing the sustainable blue economy. And for any of you involved in the sustainable blue economy here in Western Australia, I really commend it to you all for policy guidance. So from the Antarctic Peninsula, how are we going on this? From the Antarctic Peninsula, we're not quite there yet, but we're close to, I believe, this may be the year, to the Azores, which is done, from French Polynesia, which is done, to the Sargasso Sea, marine protected areas, or marine prosperity areas, which is what I prefer to call them. They're being established to fulfill this 30 by 30 target. And every coastal nation is expected to play its part within its EEZ, Exclusive Economic Zone, and Australia is doing well in that regard. And with the BB&J Treaty now in force, we must move without delay to the establishment of long talked about protected areas for the high seas, Lord Howe Ridge, for example. As a citizen of Fiji, I can say that I'm greatly encouraged by the announcement we just made recently that the Melanesian Ocean Summit will be held in Papua New Guinea, 11th to 14th May this year, where we are going to launch this Melanesian Ocean Corridor of Reserves, a groundbreaking regional network of large marine protected areas in those incredibly rich waters of Melanesia. Everything is connected, especially in the ocean. Thus, sustainable ocean economies must be anchored in that principle of connectivity, protecting biodiversity, curbing pollution, greening of shipping, development of truly sustainable aquaculture, blue biotech, and nature-friendly offshore energy production. Nothing stands alone. And the good news is that the ocean, that blue thread of connectivity, is our greatest ally in the planetary challenges posed by climate change and biodiversity loss and pollution. And happily, the green transition to renewable energy is now undeniably underway, driven on, as I've said, by that implacable force of both scientific and economic logic. In ancient Greece, Thucydides wrote that the three greatest failings were want of sense, want of courage, and want of vigilance. So therefore, in these very turbulent times, let us all be vigilant lest we be bullied out of doing the right thing for people and planet. So ladies and gentlemen, speaking to you on the abundant coast of Western Australia, it would be remiss of me not to mention fisheries, and I will not delve into local controversies. But 2026 marks the 60th anniversary of FAO's Committee on Fisheries, and some of you in this room I know have been at the Committee on Fisheries in Rome. And I'm going to be present there in September to speak at the committee and emphasize that global marine fish stocks being overfished by over 35% in 2025, that this is not good enough and the need for stronger management frameworks is manifest. But I'm happy to say that Australia's report card reads much better than the global average. While I was preparing this speech, I was in contact with FAO's Fisheries and Aquaculture Division in Rome and asked them for a candid comment. And they gave me this message, and I don't often get this sort of positive report cards, I assure you. And so, to quote them, the Australian fishing industry demonstrates effective management, a deep appreciation of the importance of this resource for food and economic opportunity, and the importance of keeping it in a sustainable state for future generations. Tick, tick, tick. From a stock assessment and management perspective, Australia is a world leader. We give Australia, this is FAO, the #1 body in the world on fisheries, we give Australia positive applause for pushing the spirit of FAO's blue transformation vision. This is their big statement for the future. Namely, the blue transformation vision, David knows this, is fisheries stocks and effective management. That's the first thing. Second thing is positive, sustainable aquaculture development. And the third thing is developing the aquatic foods value chain. That's food security, basically. So well done, Australia. So, ladies and gentlemen, likewise, here on the West Australian coast, I must touch on the subject of coral reefs. I'd like to touch on kelp as well, but anyway, let's just do coral reefs. Particularly in view of the severe coral reef bleaching event that hit Ningaloo hard over the 2024-25 summer. The no healthy planet, no healthy ocean mantra can be attenuated with no healthy coral, no healthy ocean, since up to 25% of marine biodiversity depends on coral for shelter and food and nurseries at some point in its life cycle. And I will just say that pretty much the same applies to kelp, which is a big part of your purview here in Perth. And many of you will be familiar with the IPCC's conclusion that a global temperature increase of 2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures would be catastrophic for coral reefs, resulting in the loss of more than 99% of corals globally. Coming from Fiji, I find that very hard to accept, but that is the statement. And need I say that we are still on track to over 2 degrees global warming. I mean, that's the important point here for future generations. We're still on track to somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees global warming. But it's fair to say that there are differing opinions on coral's future, and that there are a wide variety of approaches being taken to ameliorate coral's fate. I think it's also fair to say that there's no silver bullet, that solutions are not mutually exclusive, and that there's a powerful case for greater collaboration on ocean action to create a credible future for these very vulnerable ecosystems. And it's in search of that integrated collective strategy that we are convening, the Saudi Arabian government, myself, UNEP, and that's about it. Whether we're convening the Global Coral Reef Summit. This is the biggest summit ever held on coral reef. It's going to be held in Saudi Arabia in the 2nd and 3rd of November this year. Saudi Arabia, of course, are the chair of the ICRI, the lead coral organization of the world. And the summit will bring together relevant states, scientific leaders, financing partners, and will be organized around the 3 pillars of policy and regulatory frameworks and science and innovative technologies, and of course investment and sustainable financing mechanisms as well as serious money. So the summit program is being designed to support decision makers in aligning near-term priorities with long-term resilience through to 2050. It's basically a ministerial conference, and we expect at least 60 ministers present. So as stewards of globally significant reefs and as close partners to nations across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, I have no doubt the summit will give Australia a solid opportunity to demonstrate leadership in ocean and coral conservation, obviously I'm facilitating that. So ladies and gentlemen, as we get ever nearer to that 2030 date, 2030 in terms of 30 by 30, but also the maturation of the Sustainable Development Agenda, that's 2030. We've got to redouble our efforts to reach the targets that we've set ourselves, and we've got to look beyond them and begin the envisioning of a future in which the ocean's well-being, both its protection and its sustainable blue economy, is inseparably linked to humankind's well-being. And that searching is, of course, underway now. This forward thinking should be central to the global considerations taking place at the 4th UN Ocean Conference, which will happen in Korea in 2028, where we expect a picture to emerge of the world in which humanity's relationship with the ocean is aimed at becoming one of that regeneration and reciprocity and, most importantly, respect. So in these challenging times, ladies and gentlemen, it's vital that we rededicate ourselves to the true course of multilateralism, and something I fundamentally believe in as a UN person, but something that I've seen in practice works. And of course, to international law. And the prospect of rogue nations breaking international law is something which is deeply worrying. Because the alternatives range from stark lawlessness to the roughshod rule of the hegemony. And is that a world we will deliver to our children? Multilateralism delivers, and it's fortifying to observe how since that 3rd UN Ocean Conference in Nice, the momentum has been with us, and I gave you the examples thereof. And so with preparations now underway for the 4th UN decade, for this UN decade of science, remember I mentioned that, They're having a huge scientific conference of interest, a lot of people in this room, in Rio de Janeiro in April next year. Some of you might have been at the Barcelona conference, which was the predecessor of this a few years ago, but these are really important meetings for ocean science. So we'll be there in Rio, and we're confident that ocean science will continue its exponential advance on coming out of Rio. And on that event-filled course laid out for the approach to the 4th UN Ocean Conference in Korea in 2028, there are so many ports of call for SDG 14 to gain from along that eventful journey. The ocean endures. UNCLOS, the law of the sea, has enshrined it as our common inheritance, an inheritance to be managed, protected, and used for the benefit of all humanity. All the while, the ocean's call to humanity has been that we be strong in our respectfulness and in our thought and deed, so that reason and innovation will overcome the regressive forces at play. The forces we now see arraigned against science and truthfulness. So the call is to take the tide while it serves, the tide of regeneration and resilience, of trust in the best of science, and of fidelity to intergenerational justice. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Peter. I mentioned in my introduction your clarity of purpose, and I think you demonstrated that tonight very strongly. Clarity in reminding us the risk and the threats that the oceans are facing and what needs to be done to try to address it. And I think the important point as well I took away from your speech is that while we are doing all these actions at international level, in adapting and mitigating and protecting the ocean, we need to remain and maintain our focus on the primary sources of all these issues and the need to reduce fossil fuel emissions. So thanks a lot, Peter, to remind us that. We're going to continue this conversation with a panel conversation that's going to take place with some of our panelists. But let me introduce the panel, starting by Dr. Kate Quigley. So Kate is a molecular ecologist and holds joint positions as principal research scientist at Mindau Foundation, senior research scientist at UWA, and ARC DECRA fellow at James Cook University. Our research investigates the genomic basis of stress tolerance, adaptation, and resilience of coral reef organisms. She uses a range of genetic tools combined with large-scale field experimental and modeling methods to understand what makes some coral resistant to stress while others are more vulnerable. She is currently examining how fast corals can adapt to rising temperatures at Ningalo Reef, the Great Barrier Reef, Lord Howe Island, and the Putman Arbor Loss, and is developing genetic conservation tools like selective breeding to increase heat tolerance on coral reefs. Our second panelist will be Paul Gamblin. Paul is the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Marine Conservation Society. Paul has worked in conservation for 25 years in Australia and internationally to protect places like Ningalo Exmouth Gulf, the Kimberley and offshore coral reefs, and to create marine protected areas around Australia. Working in Europe, Paul was the architect of WWF International's campaign to elevate the ocean's multiple values, threats and conservation solutions globally, framing it as the world's 7th largest economy, referenced by institutions including the World Economic Forum, The Economist, and the G20. Paul, if you want to join us, thank you very much. And our last panelist is Dr. Professor Erika Teixeira. She's a professor of law at the UWA Law School, where she teaches and researches on international and comparative environmental law. Her research explores a broad range of ocean-related issues, including marine protected area management, fisheries regulation, marine pollution, and wildlife conservation of species, such as sharks, kelps, and she sails. Much of her work is in the Indo-Pacific region, particularly island states. Her most recent book is The Unruly Ocean, Law and Justice in the World, Oceans, Seas, and Shorelines. Beyond the university, she has sat on state and federal government boards, including the Heritage Council of WA and the Australian Institute of Marine Science Council. Erika has also been a member of Australian delegations, and from 29 to 22 was Australian National Focal Point on the Indian Ocean Rim Association Academic
Peter, I think I highlighted extremely well, the threat that the oceans are facing. So, but I wanted to ask you, each of you, individually, from your own scientific perspective, as a journalist, as a conservationist, and as a lawyer, starting with you, Kate. In your view, what is the state of the health of the ocean, and what are the major risks you see in the future?
First off, thank you for inviting us all here to encourage us tonight. If I might leave a mic so to tell me at my voice. How's that? Is that better? Okay. No? Okay, I'll give it an all tonight. Okay. I guess in a word, I would say uncharted territory. In the end of 2025, we crossed the 7th of 9 planetary boundaries, being ocean acidification. And these planetary boundaries really are measurable metrics that guide us in how we're using the Earth and how much we're surpassing our ability to use the resources of the Earth. So it's a very informative metric of human pressure. So crossing 7 out of 9, I was scared when we crossed the first one, but now I'm significantly worried. And, we are seeing the fallout of that kind of pressure in real time. One of the tipping points or the really important precipices when it comes to ecosystem function is how coral reefs are faring. And I know we'll talk about this a little bit later, so I won't go into it now. But last year, we also crossed a tipping point for coral reefs. So we're seeing it on the global scale with these planetary boundaries, but we're also seeing it on an ecosystem level scale where we can actually identify particular ecosystems like coral reefs that are more in trouble than ever.
Thank you, Kat. Paul, as a conservationist, what is your perspective?
Thanks. Thanks for the invitation. And Peter covered it very well, and Kate too. I would add just a couple of extra elements. It is sobering. We face a reckoning. There's no two ways about it around the state of the ocean globally and in Australia. We've lost about 50% of ocean wildlife populations since 1970. So for most of us in this room, that's very much on our watch. That includes sharks and rays, for example, and there's a whole suite of species that are right on the brink of extinction. Australia is actually a lifeboat for some of those species that face extinction around the world, species like sawfish, for example. So huge opportunity and responsibility as well. Coastal areas, nearshore environments, seagrass meadows, kelp forests, mangroves. The trends aren't good across all of those. I think there is also an awakening happening at the same time. In the last 10 years or so in particular, the level of interest, and Peter relayed this, the level of interest and momentum around ocean conservation has increased almost incrementally from a very low base. When I first started working in conservation, the ocean had a very low profile in Australia and globally, but things are really changing. So there's kind of a race between this very steep deterioration and efforts, kind of rearguard in some cases, a bit more than that in others, to actually make amends, to create levels of protection that could reduce the worst of what we're facing. In terms of climate change, it is really, really difficult and very challenging. And I think we've talked about coral reefs, we will again, but I would like to make a few points about that from a conservation perspective. I think it's a really important narrative, the coral reef narrative in Australia and globally, because it brings together climate and biodiversity decline, given that coral reefs host about a quarter of the world's biodiversity. There's also a very strong human story for the Western Indian Ocean, for Melanesia. Humans depend, some of the most vulnerable people on the planet depend on coral reefs. Some of the most privileged people, like in places like Australia, also have a very strong connection to coral reefs. So the story of coral reefs and what happens to coral reefs is our story, and it tells us a lot about what we're willing to do and what the future of the ocean is. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. So we've got scientific viewpoints. So Elika, what can you tell us from a legal perspective?
Well, I think from a legal perspective, I will be an optimist, and I'll say, following on from what Peter has said, that from a legal perspective, we've had a lot of new laws put in place. If you look purely at law by itself, then we're doing quite well. The BBNJ agreement we've heard about has come into force, but other agreements have too. The Hong Kong Shipbreaking Convention, which is about recycling of ships. There are other agreements that have come into force. And we see a lot of regional work, particularly in the Indian Ocean. You see a lot of protocols under various regional seas agreements coming into force as well. So that's one part of the story. But of course, the other part is everything we've heard about so far about the health of the ocean. Therefore, the law isn't working. So we could have the best law in the world if it's not working. And there's two ways to look at not working. One is we've got the wrong law. I don't think we necessarily do. But the other part is we're not utilizing it. We are not implementing it. We're not complying with it as well as we can to make it work at the very best level that can. So I would say we've got the tools. Law is just a tool. It's not data. It's not science. It's just a tool. We've got to make that tool work better.
Thanks a lot. I'll come back to that, but first I'd like to go back to you, Kate, and talk a bit more. So we know that the ocean warming is accelerating, and so is acidification and deoxygenation. So, and you mentioned tipping points. So can you develop a bit more onto that? And what are these tipping points? But also, what is not understood necessarily by the general public and policymakers, to really appreciate how close we are to these tipping points.
So when it comes to warming, unfortunately, heat is very good at killing things like corals. And in the last 2 years, we've seen global temperatures jump 0.4 degrees Celsius. And 0.4 degrees Celsius might not seem like a lot, but for a coral that already naturally exists close to its thermal limit, every 10th of a degree makes a difference between sometimes life and death. And whilst that might be shocking, that's also an opportunity for us where it might seem like we're fighting for 1.5, fighting for 1.6, fighting for 1.7. And that, we did see the global kind of temperature reach 2 degrees of additional warming. And that might seem like a failure, but, every 10th of a degree we can bring that down or prevent it from getting higher makes a difference for corals. So, every bit of ambition that we have around cutting emissions matters for reefs. And so I would definitely say, the data isn't warming is the issue when it comes to reefs. But acidification is kind of the insidious bedfellow when it comes to climate change. And we know from experiments and incredible field studies that have gone and cored, 1,000-year-old Phraites colonies, these big, massive bombings that we can find on reefs, that acidification essentially erodes the growth of corals over time. And so you kind of get a double whammy where you're not getting coral growth, which is linked to reproduction and, of course, linked to regeneration of the reef. And then you get the kind of outright pressure and mortality caused by the temperature. And you asked about policy, what is the linkage there with policy? And, unfortunately, I think there's a real synergy going on here that we still have yet to understand about these cumulative pressures that we are kind of giving that onslaught to many ecosystems. So, probably the policy hasn't caught up with warming. Well, we know that the policy hasn't quite caught up with warming. It hasn't caught up with acidification, and it hasn't caught up with the cumulative effects of all the pressures that we're adding. But there's many people out there fighting the good fight to communicate. And, the good news is we know what the elephant is. We know what the big stressor is. So now it's really about having the ambition to do maybe not what is the easy decision, but right decision for them all.
Thank you, Kate. I'm coming back to you, Paul. So in addition to the challenges we just heard, we've got a significant loss of biodiversity. And I wanted to ask you, do you think that the conservation tools that we've got are fit for purpose in a very rapidly and increasing, ocean threat?
Yes and no. So we do know what to do. Sorry if there's feedback. We know what we need to do. We have enough scientific evidence. We have enough experience to know what we need to do. We need to give the ocean a break. We need to create protected areas, marine protected areas. We know they work in a whole range of contexts. The 30 by 30 approach that Australia is playing a leading role in, so we still have somewhere to go, is actually being good and will deliver a lot. So protecting habitat is crucial, but marine protected areas are only part of it. We need to protect nearshore areas, coastal areas. We need leaders to understand the intrinsic values of algal mats, of mangroves, of seagrass meadows, of all of these coastal areas. They're absolutely fundamental. And the level of understanding, I have to say, in many areas of leadership in this country are not what they need to be. Levels of ocean literacy are not what they need to be. And so we often see decisions made to approve forms of development, dredging, things like that cause enormous damage to the marine ecosystem, to marine users, to fishing industry, for example, and others. So protecting habitat is really important. The evidence is there. We know that makes a major difference. And understanding the values, often the hidden values of coastal and nearshore ecosystems, and building literacy in the eyes of decision makers, being conscious of the short-termism in terms of commercial investment and also in terms of political cycles as well. And the problem of privatizing profits and socializing costs, the externalities and the tragedy of the commons, all of these things bring to bear significant impacts that we see meted out in Australia and around the world with this destruction and damage done to coastal and nearshore habitats. That's a real problem. There's also a lot of work that we need to do in terms of reducing the impact on threatened species. And Australia has been doing a good job, and the fishing industry has been doing a reasonable job, but there's still plenty of work to do. There's some really old forms of fishing and some quite destructive gear that we really need to get a handle on for the benefit of the marine environment and actually for the reputation of the fishing industry generally. So there's still a lot of work to do. Relatively speaking, Australia is doing better than most of the rest of the world in terms of the management of its fisheries. But the base, I think you'd probably agree, Peter, is pretty low overall. So Australia is a leader, but we need to do a whole lot more in that arena as well.
Thank you, Paul. So Peter, I'll come back to you. So as a global food level, you mentioned the SDG 40, the high C30, the 30 by 30. So it looks like we are going towards the right direction, but are there areas where the momentum is stalling? And are we doing enough?
Well, we're definitely not doing enough because the decline is continuing, but we can see that what we're putting in place has the potential to turn that decline into something, well, first of all, stopping the decline, but also going into a positive incline. And I do believe that we're smart enough as a species, just for our own sense of survival, that we're going to get there. I don't know how we're going to do it, whether it's AI, whether it's geoengineering, whether it's just the fact that we smarten up, or whether the next generation is smarter than us, most likely. I do believe we'll get there. And, you know, I'm a grandfather of 4 granddaughters, and I just cannot believe that they're going to be living in a world on fire. I don't think our species is dumb enough to actually take us to that position, which we are, where we're heading to at the moment. But I think that at some stage, the Homo sapiens, the intelligent species that came from the Stone Age to the Space Age in a blink of an eye in planetary terms, isn't going to have the nous to come up with the necessaries to stop the decline and start the incline. That's a message of hope which I give to my granddaughters, and when I look at them in the eyes, I just can't believe that we're going to let them burn, or that they will let themselves burn. But of course there are tough times ahead. I'm not rose-spectacled on that. So are we doing enough? No. I mentioned young people. One of the things that we push very hard from the UN side is education. UNESCO in particular has developed what's called a blue curriculum program, which is available to any country that wants to get that. It's how to get the blue curriculum into your primary schools right through to your higher education. And happy to say that Brazil is the first country to pick that up last year. They've now adopted that as a national curriculum. I give as an example of that, and I don't think it was just us at Suva Grammar School, just generally in the world. We weren't taught anything about Prochlorococcus. You know, and people say, well, why would you bother? You know, every kid in the world knows about pandas, right? But if pandas went extinct tomorrow, you know, there'd be a lot of joy lost by the loss of those lovely cuddly bears, but we would continue to exist. But if Prochlorococcus went extinct, so would we. You know, Prochlorococcus, this little critter, produces 20% of the oxygen in the biosphere. So don't you think we should be teaching our kids about Prochlorococcus instead of pandas? You know, in terms of priority, sure, teach them about pandas. Teach them about Prochlorococcus first, for goodness sake. So this is the whole point of the blue curriculum.
So very briefly, you were 2030 is the horizon. So what success would like in 2030 involved?
Success in 2030, well, 30% the planet protected, especially the ocean, would be my big call. But, you know, for I'm actually quite hopeful now. I wasn't when it came in. I thought, well, that's too hard an ask. But I'm actually getting quite hopeful now. And even if we don't get to it, the fact that we try to get to it will get us to it shortly thereafter. So, you know, we have to push on with that one. Because what happens when we get to 2030? You know, we have to be thinking about, what about 2040? What about 2050? Where are we going? I've instituted a think tank process where we're getting together twice a year, different groups of people in different places around the world, just thinking about that future. Where do we want to position ocean work post-2030? So between now and 2030, I think it's just trying to meet the goals that we've set ourselves. That would satisfy me by 2030. Can I just say that SDG 14, those of you that follow it will know that it's regarded as the most underfunded of all the SDGs. You know, that's almost a cliche. But what I don't say to many people is that SDG 14 is actually the second most successful SDG in terms of meeting its targets. Now, the reason I don't say that to many people is that I just don't think we set high enough targets. They weren't ambitious enough. And the fact that we've met ones like, you know, the legal target, you know, as you say, we've been very successful on that, or the scientific target, you know, we've been very successful. We've met those targets, but the fact that we've met them, you can't be satisfied when that decline is continuing.
Thank you, Peter. So I'd like to move on marine protected areas, which have been quite a controversial topic over the last few weeks. So, Erika, how do we ensure that marine protected areas deliver real protection rather than symbolic targets?
Can I answer the last question instead?
Yeah, go. You can start by that one, but you're not escaping this one.
No, I will answer the question. From a law and policy perspective, my PhD was on marine protected areas in the Pacific, as it turns out, many years ago. Marine protected areas serve a purpose. They're a tool, but I don't think they can be used alone. They have to be used with other measures as well. So we have to have species-based measures. We have to have market-based measures. We have to have a suite of things. How can we make marine protected areas work by themselves? I don't think is very hard. We can make them work, we can put them in the right places, we can put them in the right places for the right reasons, and we can have the right mix of activities, which we see on the Great Barrier Reef, where we have some areas that are really locked down, no-take zones, some areas maybe no access zones, some areas for recreation, some still for some fishing. We can make marine protected areas work, but I'm not a believer that they will work as a legal tool by themselves, in the absence of financial measures, other rights-based measures, and a focus on particular species, the sentinel species, the keystone species. The species that have the greatest functional value need some extra protection beyond just a marine protected area. So from a purely legal point of view, I'm a believer in compliance. We can enforce 10% of our laws if we're lucky, maybe 20%. Any country in the world and the global community struggles with enforcement because it's very costly, it's resource intensive, it takes time, and there are so many other pressures on government. So compliance is what's important, which comes back to your ocean literacy. The more all people understand, the more they are likely to comply with the law. They need to understand the problem, the challenge, they need to understand their connectedness to the ocean, and they need to understand and believe in the law. Because if you don't believe in the law, you will fight against it, or you will try to get out of it, or you'll find a loophole. If you believe in the law, we become policemen for each other. And that's where I think that we can make marine protected areas work, is through greater compliance, self-compliance, voluntary compliance, which is based on what you've said, Paul, about awareness.
Thank you, Erika. I'll follow up on that, because as with the government, CWA, but also all around the world, have to increasingly navigate very strong reaction from fishing communities and other interests. as resources build-up from over extraction, habitat damage, and climate change. So I'd like to discuss how governments can draw on science and build community and stakeholder support for sometimes major and controversial change and reform. And so I think to have all of your point of view is distinguished. I think Paul, starting with you.
Yeah, well, there are a few examples of that, of where governments have to make decisions that are sometimes received, create controversy. I think one of the things we're seeing around the issue of overfishing off Western Australia right now, demersal fish stocks, for example, is I think we applaud the government actually for taking strong action. It's a difficult thing to do, and you can see the reaction from some in the community to government doing the right thing based on the best available science. Can be politically difficult for governments, but one of the lessons I think from this kind of experience that we're seeing right now is that sometimes often governments don't take action when they should, and the longer you leave things, particularly in the environment, the worse they tend to get, and so the political price and the risk increases quite rapidly over time. So the lesson is, take the science seriously, engage with the community, explain your rationale to the community, and then make decisions based on the best available science when that science comes through. If you delay it for years and sometimes decades, it becomes a very, very difficult decision to make. So we applaud governments making the right decisions, but they need to listen more, they need to monitor, they need to build the evidence base so that when they need to make a decision, it's there and it's clear to the community why they're making those decisions.
Yeah, I know. I agree with the view that you just can't establish an MPA and expect everything to be okay. I prefer to think of MPAs as marine prosperity areas because I firmly believe that they have such huge economic benefits as well as the environmental benefits. I'll give you a few examples. Where my family goes for holidays in Fiji, up in the Osawa Islands, we stay in a very small hotel there, which is the people who own the land, the local community, local indigenous community, all the people that work in the hotel from that same community. They decided, let's have a marine protected area right in front of the hotel. And why? Because we want tourists to come, see a beautiful reef, go snorkeling, and see this biodiversity. Let's see how we go. You would expect that to be the most polluted bay on the island because of having a hotel on it. Of course, they don't have sewage systems the way you have on the mainland, things like that. But one of the reasons we go to that hotel time and time again is that bay is just like it was when I was a kid in Fiji snorkeling for the first time. The biodiversity is incredible. The coral is incredible. Go to the next bay, and the next bay, and the next bay, it's not like that. Why? Because they're being overexploited, for various reasons, but mainly to, feed the kids. They're just being, all the biodiversity is sucked out of them, right? So there's an economic benefit for the community in keeping that marine protected area in front of the hotel because no reef, no healthy biodiversity. I don't think we as a family would go there anymore, and probably all the other guests. So tick to them. Let's go to Niue, independent country near Tonga. Niue, their model is put, I think it's like 90% of their huge exclusive economic zone into a marine protected area and then sell that. Buy shares in it. If you want to buy shares in the Niue MPA, you can. It's a fund, it's an endowment fund. Don't ask me the full legal structure, but basically you can buy a share in the Niuean MPA and all the money that comes from that, and they're quite successful, by the way, and people like Bezos Earth Fund have invested in it, as have I, and your dividend is the fact that you can see a healthy ocean. That's your dividend. You're not getting paid a check, right? You're just like, oh my God, I've bought a bit of the ocean to keep safe. Nobody's going to take anything out of that. And the funds that, because it's invested, the funds that come out go towards the Niuean schools, health system, and so on. So it's purely a community thing. So that's a good model. Azores, I was with the president of Azores recently. He had the same struggle that any big MPA being set up anywhere in the world has a struggle with, which is the fisheries industry. The fisheries is saying, hey, you can't put an MPA there, that's our fishing grounds. Okay, so Azores, you all know, you probably buy your anchovies or sardines from the Azores down at your local supermarket. It's their main industry, fisheries industry. But the fisheries industry and the environmental lobbyists in the Azores, after really decades of negotiation, came to the agreement that, okay, we need, this is MPA, that is MPA, that is MPA, this you can fish, that you can only fish in certain months. Quite a complicated mosaic, but they came up with that balance, so they got it right. And as a result, the North Atlantic's largest MPA is now in the Azores, by just getting that balance right between the fishing industry and the environment. So there are many different models to follow, but one thing I do believe in is MPAs. I really do think they are the future. That's why 30 by 30 is so important. I do a shout out to Minderoo Foundation for the great work they're doing on that. People like Waite Institute, Bezos Earth Fund, they're all backing 30 by 30 meaningfully. So, this is one of the reasons why I have a lot of hope that we're going to get there.
So Peter, you just touched on finance and then make the conclude with that actually. So the United Nations Development Program latest report showed that for every dollar we spent in protecting nature, we spent $30 in destroying it. So with such an enormous unbalance in financial flow, how do we shift global, national and sectorial finance systems, including subsidies, private capital, and public budgets to actually move the needle?
I think to start with, we have to, it goes against my grain, everything that I ever believed in, but we have to now accept this. You have to put a dollar value on nature. Every corporation, every government, it has to be on their balance sheet, what they value nature as, because they're getting that service for free. But why should they get that service for free? It should be on everybody's balance book, nature, and the ocean, in that sense, has a dollar value. I had a pipe dream about 6 years ago that why wouldn't we just clip the ticket? Like, if you're building a motorway, you clip the ticket and you pay for your motorway by all the vehicles that go down. Why don't we clip the ticket on the people that use the high seas, Emails. You probably think your emails go through satellites. They don't. They go across the seafloor through copper cables. Why don't we clip the ticket on every email? It's such a small amount that you'd clip it that nobody would notice, and the cable companies who I've talked to wouldn't care that much either. Just all pass on the consumer, and none of you would notice it in your annual budgets. So that's one. What about shipping? A ship comes in the high seas. Don't tell me these things are not doing some form of damage by going into that global commons. Certainly the cables are. Certainly the ships are. What about when we start taking genetic material out of the high seas? Shouldn't we be compensated for that in some way? When I say we, I mean the global commons of the ocean. That is the common heritage of humankind. Right? So if we do that clipping, and we establish a fund, then we can start funding our MPAs. We can start funding our coral work from this great big ocean fund. It's called the One Ocean Finance Facility now. That's a mouthful. I try to call it just the Ocean Facility. But why I speak about this now is where it was a pipe dream, it was probably a pub conversation 6 years ago. I was at a meeting in Nairobi 3 months ago at the UN Environmental Assembly, and in that meeting room, the Ocean Facility was presented as this is something that we have to get well cooked and ready to launch at the UN Ocean Conference in Seoul in Korea in 2028. We've got a lot of work to do in the meantime. Who's sitting around the room agreeing to that? 15 ministers from 15 very serious countries, ocean countries, from UK through to Fiji, at ministerial level, plus all of the UN family, and Inger Anderson, the head of UNEP, was the one who opened that meeting. So, suddenly it dawned on me, oh my God, this is actually going to happen. Because once you get that kind of momentum going, it's going to happen. So now we've got big multi-billion dollar pot of money, if we get it right, to do this good work in the ocean that will be required. So I think there are many different models, and just got to keep looking at this.
going to say, if we try to pull together those examples, I think there's financing and there's value. And I think if all people value the ocean, we can respect it and we can use it in different ways. And we do that in this state. And your example, Peter, is an excellent one of going on holiday, and we are snorkeling at a reef and we pay for that. And we pay for a tour out to Ningaloo Reef. So we are paying. And international law and domestic law allows for both a user pays system and a polluter pays system. So we are picking up on that cost element. The other side to the company balance sheet, of course, for companies, they operate on money. The corporations' laws around the world, they're designed to make money for shareholders. Therefore, the balance sheet argument works well for them. But we have to also respect that we're incredibly privileged here. And there are people who have no choices about where they fish, about how to get food for their family, about what their livelihood is. And so we need to find other sustainable livelihoods for people if we're asking them to give up their only source of money or their only source of food. So it's just such a complex issue. And you know, I think the word value, money is only part of the value we need to have for the ocean, and we need to build into our systems.
Thank you, Erika. I'd like to move on questions to the public. I've got quite a few here. And so starting with that one, which I think is for you, Peter, is what is the future of the UN treaties under current political instability as countries are increasingly stepping back or delaying previous commitments? I'll take an example. You know, recently the European Commission has retreated on the commitment to not produce any petrol car by 2030.
Yeah.
And so now the new policy is 90% of petrol car.
Yeah.
So 10% of petrol car by 2035.
Yeah.
Under the lobbying of the car industry. So all that is going to affect the commitments we've made and the trajectory we've got.
The fossil fuel industry is very effectively organized, as you'd expect, the world's biggest industry, and they're doing extremely well at the moment in terms of that factor. But you know, I mentioned multilateralism as being what governs the planet. I mean, just logic, right? But it's slow, it's tedious, and it's not the only answer. You know, you've got regionalism. You just mentioned the EU, for example, and ASEAN. They organise themselves pretty well regionally. In the Pacific, we've got fantastic regional organisations. I mean, I'm just so proud of our regional organisations. Australia's part of most of them. If you think of fisheries organisations, for example, we're world leaders in regionalism when it comes to that. So that works. And then, you know, bilateralism works as well. You know, if somebody's slapping a monstrous tariff on you, just go to somebody else and make a deal with somebody else. There are lots of other big countries that you can do deals with. So bilateralism works as well. So I'm not suggesting that multilateralism is the only tool available to us. It's, you know, it's a free world.
I think Erika wants to follow up on that.
Well, I think it's interesting because I was teaching presenting to a group of students from Japan this morning, and they asked me the very same question about the US. When somebody that doesn't believe leaves the room, sometimes it's easier to have conversations and make what you have work. So if a party leaves the room, then you've got the believers who are still in the room, who are still wanting to make that law work, wanting to take it forward. Also, humans are mammals, and mammals, as best I understand it as a lawyer, that the top predator leaves and the others fill the gap. So I think that there will be other countries that take the lead in certain areas. Peter's talked about Australia taking the lead in some places. We don't take the lead in all places. Other countries do. There are different countries. But going back to the very first question I never got to answer, which is a great question, where do you want to be by 2030? One thing I would like to see by 2030 is a principle of non-regression. Because in human rights, we have a principle of non-regression. We can never go back. But what you're talking about, Christophe, with Europe, that is going backwards. Now, we don't have that principle in international environmental law. We have a principle of polluter pays. We have the precautionary principle. We don't have non-regression. So by 2030, 74 years, it's not long.
You have something, Erika. I wanted to finish with that, so we'll come back to you. So I'll take another question from the public. So Australia imports a large percentage of its seafood. So to what extent does assessment of fisheries account for environmental impacts that are effectively outsourced overseas? And I don't know if we've got the knowledge in the panel to answer that question. So the thing is that we import a lot of our seafood. And so how do we make sure that standards that we impose on ourselves are actually respected, in the countries where you're in simple fairness.
Happy to kick that off if you like. It's a really important question, and it does go to the importance of multilateral negotiations and agreements, and we're getting much better at that. And Peter's laid out a whole lot of progress that we've seen in just the last few years. And Australia is well regarded in the international sphere. I've been on delegation with the Australian government in terms of international fisheries negotiations, for example, and we are seen as a straight-talking middle power, and we have a responsibility, even though we are dwarfed by some of the bigger players. But we have a lot of work to do, including around dealing with illegal fishing in our broader region, making sure that we are exerting every bit of leverage that we can to improve practices to support coastal communities who are often desperate and have very little alternative as well, as Erica has been reminding us of as well. So being sensitive and understanding our broader region and why some of the practices there aren't at the same standard that we enjoy in Australia. So it's a complicated area. It's an area that we've worked in as Australian Marine Conservation Society, Minderoo and others have as well, and it's really important ongoing work. The Australian fishing industry, there's some representatives here, have responsibilities there, and there are opportunities to advance joint advocacy with the Australian government so that it actually takes full potential of its role to actually support regional fisheries arrangements as well.
Thanks a lot, Paul. I'll take one last question, and it's actually a legal question, so I'm coming back to you, Erica. And I actually may have two questions in one, so that, it's moving continuously on Slido. Here we are. So will there be actual legal consequences to country not respecting 30 by 30 agreements? And so, following that, how successful have law cases been in protecting our oceans?
No, and 50-50. I mean, the 30 by 30 is not a binding target. It's set in the Global Biodiversity Framework and the SDGs. The SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, are not legally binding. They are targets. Law doesn't like a target because it's usually a stretch target. Law wants certainty, so there's rules. But we need those stretch targets. They're what we call soft law, not legally binding, or their global policy. So no, they're not. It's not legally binding. I think we're probably going to. I agree with Peter. I think we're probably going to meet that goal. It's because it's a target we can aim for and collectively achieve. What was the second part of the question? Oh, how do we enforce? Well, I'm not very big on enforcement because it's just you've got to take resources and money away from something else in order to enforce this law. So it's about compliance. How do we get people to comply? Is partly an education or a psychology. We've got or behavioural science, the other disciplines that will be on your panel next year. Those social sciences that are about changing, shifting behaviours of people. But we can enforce law. We do enforce law at different scales. It's not the best use of international law, in my view. I don't think we should be running cases against different countries very often. Cases or proceedings or enforcement provisions are sort of localised within national jurisdictions. They work quite well, but it depends upon resources. It depends upon surveillance, monitoring, policing, and the ability to bring those proceedings, the evidence, all those aspects. I think the international level is better for setting standards, and maybe we just ask a little bit too much of it if we're saying how can international law be enforced. Mostly it's for countries to enforce. There are no international police. There's no international ocean enforcement body, really. So we're maybe asking a little bit too much of that.
So it's time to conclude. So may I ask you, in just one sentence, and specifically for the younger audience, we've got it. What makes you hopeful that eventually we are going to overcome this massive challenge that we're facing today? Let me check first, in one sentence.
There's still a lot left that can be saved and worth fighting for, and nature shows us over and over how resilient it is. And so if we just gave it a bit of room and really were ambitious and use the data that we have and use the technology that we have, I think it's not too late, but the time is running out, and we need to get cracking with what I think we all know needs to be done.
Thanks a lot, Kate. Paul?
Thanks. I take inspiration from success in conservation, creating protected areas, protecting special places, Western Australia, places like Ningaloo and the Kimberley and many others. I think it's going to be about looking to see where the rubber hits the road, holding governments to account, inspiring governments to do the right thing, and to continue on the theme of biodiversity and climate. We've got some big decisions that the government needs to make on our collective behalf. One of them is going to crystallise some of that, and that's whether we will create a vision and a sense of legacy to protect Scott Reef, one of our most significant offshore reefs, one of the biggest, in fact the biggest offshore reef in Australia, that is almost entirely unprotected and is currently in the crosshairs for oil and gas development, for massive fossil fuel development for the next half century. These are the moments, these are the tests of our resolve. These are the things that governments need to consider in terms of giving future generations hope. This is where the rubber hits the road. We have the opportunity to do the right thing. So by 2030, to go to that question as well, by 2030, I'd like to see places like Scott Reef fully protected as part of the 30 by 30 agenda, and that we have agreed not to open up any new fossil fuel fields in Australia.
That's a very long sentence, even by my standard. Okay, I shall say something provocative because otherwise, we won't say it. It doesn't matter either way to me. The ocean will win. Either we kill ourselves or we care for the ocean. So that's what gives me hope, is the ocean will be fine, ultimately, because we need to understand that we depend on the ocean for our very survival. So that's what gives me hope, is that we either do what we can and do what we have to, or we're really kind of putting a nail in our own coffin.
It's a very awful message, thank you.
Absolutely 100% with that last remark. I was going to say, we come from the ocean, it's our mother. Show our mother the respect that she deserves, and she'll look after us. But since it's my final word, what I do want to say to you guys is this, that I go around I'm in a different country pretty much every second week and have been doing that for a long, long time. I see oceanographic institutes around the world. I go to cities where there is a lot of attention given to the ocean. I think of Qingdao in China. I think of places like Woods Hole in Massachusetts, Plymouth in the UK. The point I'm making is that coming to Perth has just been such an eye-opener for me. This is an amazing ocean community you've got here. The Indian Ocean is underrepresented, not just in science, but just in politics and regional organizations and all the rest. The Pacific, we're pretty well organized. The Atlantic is very well organized, but the Indian Ocean always a bit of a problem, and I know this from the UN experience, how do you get the Indian Ocean together? So I think the work that's being done here in Perth for the Indian Ocean is really important. Obviously it's very important for Australia, but it's also really important for the Indian Ocean, and therefore globally really important. And I've just been blown away over the last 2 days about the quality, the depth that's here in Perth, University of Western Australia, the Oceans Institute, all the labs I've been touring today, just incredible, I was going to say groundbreaking, but I guess wave-breaking stuff that's going on, plastic substitutes from seaweed and things like that, it's so encouraging. And the message I really want to take away from my visit to Perth is, invest in these institutions. Trust the output from these institutions. Everybody needs to pay a heck of a lot more attention to what is going on here in terms of your ocean scientific research and your recommendations that are coming out of that. So I've been very, very impressed, and I just want to leave that with you. What you're doing here is so important for Australia, for the Indian Ocean, and for the world. Thank you very much for what you're doing.
Peter Peter, just to be clear, I didn't whisper anything. But we've been having a very busy program of engagement, and so I want to thank.
We are going to have a meeting tomorrow about strategy and how we're going to better convey this to the world about what's here in Perth.
Thank you very much. But very grateful of your time, and so please join me in thanking you.